For over 1,000 years, the Slavic peoples built empires, fought wars, and shaped the destiny of an entire continent. But here's what nobody expected to find. Buried in their DNA was the story of an ancient invasion that rewrote human history. A revelation so profound that scientists are now questioning everything we thought we knew about where these 300 million people actually came from. And the answer? It's nothing like the textbooks told us. The mystery begins. Scientists made a discovery that changed everything. In laboratories across Europe and America, researchers began extracting ancient DNA from skeletal remains buried thousands of years underground. Not fresh bones, not mummified bodies. These were fragments. Tiny, degraded pieces of genetic material that had survived millennia in the earth. The technology was revolutionary. For the first time in human history, we could actually read the genetic code of the dead. What they found was astonishing. The DNA told a story that contradicted centuries of assumptions. Slavic ancestry wasn't what scholars had believed. It wasn't a simple narrative of continuous habitation or natural development. Instead, the genetic record revealed something far more dramatic. Waves of migration, conquest, and population replacement that fundamentally altered the genetic makeup of millions of people. This wasn't just academic curiosity. Understanding where a people come from, truly understanding it, changes how they see themselves. It affects how nations view their borders, their claims, their identity. For the Slavic peoples, this genetic revelation touched something primal, their origin story, and that story was far stranger than anyone had imagined. But we need to start at the beginning. Before the science and before the revelations, there was only darkness. Thousands of years of human history written in the genetic code of a people who had no idea what secrets their ancestors carried in their cells. Who were the original Slavs? The question sounds simple. Who were the Slavs? For most of history, this question had no answer. The ancient Greeks and Romans wrote very little about the peoples living in Eastern Europe. They were mysterious, distant, relegated to the margins of the classical world. The earliest written records of Slavs appear around the 6th century AD in Byzantine texts. But by then, Slavic peoples were already spread across a vast territory. From the Baltic Sea in the north to Greece in the south, from the Black Sea in the east to the Danube in the west. How did they get there? Traditional history offered a story of gradual settlement and expansion. Historians imagined peaceful waves of agricultural people moving eastward, spreading their language, establishing communities. It was a narrative that felt logical, orderly. It fit the pattern scholars saw in other early European populations. But the ancient DNA would tell a different story. The key breakthrough came when scientists sequenced DNA from ancient skeletons found in Ukraine, Poland, Russia, and the Balkans. Skeletons dating back 5,000, 6,000, even 8,000 years. What emerged was a complex picture of human movement and biological mixing that nobody fully expected. The story wasn't one of simple continuity. Instead, it was one of conquest, displacement, and absorption. Multiple waves of people moving into the same regions, populations replacing other populations, genetic lineages mixing over centuries until something entirely new emerged. The Slavic peoples as we know them today are the biological result of this ancient mixing. This matters because it rewrites the origin story of hundreds of millions of people. The Indo-European puzzle. To understand the Slavic genetic story, we need to look at an even bigger picture. Around 4,000 years ago, somewhere on the steppes north of the Black Sea, a fascinating transformation happened. Nomadic warrior cultures developed new technologies. The horse, the wheel, effective bronze weapons. These innovations were revolutionary, and they gave certain populations the ability to move farther, faster, and more lethally than anyone before them. What followed was one of history's great mysteries, the Indo-European expansion. Scientists call these ancient warriors the Yamnaya. We know almost nothing about their culture, their language, their beliefs, but we know what they did. They moved. Over centuries, Yamnaya populations and their descendants spread outward from the steppes in multiple directions, into Europe, into the Middle East, into India, into the Iranian plateau. Wherever they went, they encountered existing populations. And what followed was biological mixing on a massive scale. This was not peaceful settlement. Archaeological evidence suggests conflict, conquest, and population replacement. In many regions, the genetic signature is clear. Within a few centuries, the majority of the DNA in a population shifted from local ancestry to steppe ancestry. The original populations didn't disappear entirely. Their genes survived, mixed into the genetic pool of the incoming peoples. But genetically, they were overwhelmed. The Indo-European expansion shaped the genetic and linguistic landscape of Europe. Today, most European languages, from English to Spanish to Russian, are Indo-European languages, a legacy of the Yamnaya and their descendants. The Slavic languages are part of this family. But the Slavic genetic story is uniquely complex. It wasn't a simple case of Indo-European conquest and assimilation. It was something more intricate. The Slavic genetic foundation. When geneticists examined the DNA of modern Slavic populations, Poles, Ukrainians, Russians, Serbs, Czechs, Bulgarians, they found something unexpected in the genetic layers. The Slavic peoples carried multiple ancestry streams. First, there was steppe ancestry. This came from the Indo-European migrations thousands of years ago. Slavic peoples inherited the genetic legacy of those ancient conquerors. This ancestry forms a significant component of Slavic genetic makeup. But that wasn't all. Slavic peoples also carried substantial ancestry from earlier European populations. These were the people who lived in Europe before the Indo-European migrations. They were hunter-gatherers and early farmers who had adapted to the European landscape over thousands of years. Their genes remained mixed into the Slavic genetic pool. This wasn't unusual for Europeans generally. Most European populations show this pattern, a blend of steppe ancestry and local ancestry. But Slavic peoples had something else, a unique genetic signature that suggested another element to their ancestry. This element was Anatolian. Ancient Anatolian populations, people from what is now Turkey, had migrated into Europe during the Neolithic period. They brought with them agriculture, new tools, new ways of living. For a long time, Anatolian ancestry was strongest in southern and western Europe. But scientists discovered something fascinating. Slavic peoples carried more Anatolian ancestry than expected for an Eastern European population. This suggested something unexpected about the history of Slavic settlement. It suggested that the immediate ancestors of Slavic peoples didn't come exclusively from one source. Instead, they came from multiple regions, some from the steppes, some from existing European populations, some with roots traced back to Anatolia. Over centuries, these ancestral populations mixed, moved, and eventually coalesced into what we recognize as the Proto-Slavic peoples. This is where history and geography collide with genetics. The Great Migration. The period from about 500 AD to 800 AD was the era when Slavic peoples exploded across Eastern Europe. This wasn't gradual settlement, this was rapid expansion. Archaeological evidence shows Slavic settlements suddenly appearing across vast territories. In some regions, the settlement pattern is so abrupt that scholars call it a migration. Thousands of years of Slavic absence, and then suddenly Slavic peoples everywhere. The traditional explanation was simple. Slavic populations grew large enough to require more territory, so they expanded. But the genetic evidence suggests something more complex. DNA from ancient Slavic burials, some dating to the 7th century, reveals that the early Slavic populations were genetically diverse. This diversity can't be explained by simple population growth in one location. Instead, it suggests that the people we call Slavs represented a merging of populations from different origins. Genetic evidence now suggests these early Slavic peoples came from multiple source regions. Some came from the forest regions north of the Carpathian Mountains. Some came from areas around the Dnieper River in present-day Ukraine. Some came from the Danube Valley in modern-day Romania and Serbia. Over generations, these populations mixed, shared a common language, and gradually expanded together. They weren't invaders replacing existing populations. They were settlers, moving into regions that had been depopulated by plague, war, or climatic change. This was a period of instability in Europe. The Roman Empire had collapsed in the West. Byzantine control over the Balkans was fragile. Germanic kingdoms were consolidating their power. In this power vacuum, Slavic peoples expanded, not through military conquest, but through settlement and absorption of existing populations. By 800 AD, Slavic settlements stretched from the Baltic Sea to Greece. The linguistic and genetic foundation of modern Slavic Europe was in place. But the story didn't end there. The Viking complication. Around 800 AD, something unexpected happened in Eastern Europe. Viking warriors from Scandinavia began moving down the river systems. The Dnieper River, the Volga River, the Neva River. These weren't isolated raids. This was organized exploration and settlement. Within decades, Scandinavian Vikings had established trading posts and fortifications throughout Russia and Ukraine. The Vikings called themselves Varangians. For centuries, historians debated what the Varangians actually did. Were they conquerors, settlers, traders? The genetic evidence now provides a clearer picture. The Vikings did mix with local Slavic populations. Genetic studies of modern Eastern Europeans reveal Viking ancestry. It's particularly pronounced in Russia and Ukraine. This ancestry comes from the period of Varangian settlement and rule, roughly 800 to 1000 AD. The Vikings didn't completely replace the Slavic populations, but they did introduce significant genetic material. This mixing had consequences. The Varangians established the first organized state structures in Russia and Ukraine. They created the Kingdom of Rus, which would eventually become the Russian Empire. In this process, Scandinavian genes mixed with Slavic genes, Scandinavian culture mixed with Slavic culture. The result was something entirely new. Eastern Slavic civilization, shaped by both its Slavic foundation and its Viking heritage. This genetic fact has profound implications. Russians often see themselves as fundamentally Slavic, but genetically, many Russians carry significant Viking ancestry. This isn't a threat to Russian identity, it's simply historical fact. The Varangians didn't conquer and enslave the Slavs. They mixed with them, they married them, they were absorbed into the larger Slavic population, yet this fact was largely unknown for most of history. The Mongol invasion mystery. In 1237 AD, an army emerged from the steppes that would terrify Europe. The Mongols, led by Batu Khan, invaded Russia and Ukraine. This wasn't a typical medieval conquest. The Mongol invasion was devastating. Cities were destroyed, populations were decimated. For centuries, the Mongols ruled over Russian and Eastern European territories, collecting tribute and maintaining military dominance. The impact was supposed to be genetic as well as political. Many historians assumed that the Mongol invasion would have introduced significant Central Asian genetic material into Eastern European populations. After all, the Mongol Empire stretched from East Asia to Eastern Europe. Tens of thousands of Mongols and Central Asians lived in European territories for over 2 centuries. Genetic mixing seemed inevitable, but the ancient DNA told a surprising story. Genetic studies of populations in regions under Mongol rule show surprisingly little Central Asian ancestry. In Russia, Ukraine, and Poland, Mongol-era DNA sequences don't show significant admixture from East Asian or Central Asian sources. This was unexpected. The explanation likely involves demographics and social structure. The Mongols were a minority ruling elite. They maintained relatively separate military structures. Over time, they were gradually assimilated into the local populations, but perhaps not as extensively as expected. Additionally, some Mongol groups were gradually replaced by new rulers and populations. The Golden Horde fragmented. New states emerged. The Mongol genetic legacy, while present, is subtler than anticipated. This genetic finding contradicts some historical assumptions. It suggests that while the Mongol political and cultural impact on Russia was enormous, establishing patterns of governance, trade, and military organization that would persist for centuries, their genetic impact was more limited. History isn't written only in genes. Politics, culture, and ideas matter just as much. The Eastern versus Western divide. Genetic research has revealed something fascinating about Slavic populations. Eastern and Western Slavs, despite sharing language roots and cultural heritage, have somewhat different genetic profiles. These differences tell stories of different migrations and different interactions with neighboring populations. Western Slavs, like Poles and Czechs, show stronger genetic connections to Central European populations. Their genes reflect more mixing with Germanic peoples. Historically, this makes sense. Poland and Bohemia were in constant contact with Germanic kingdoms and territories. The border between Slavic and Germanic Europe was fluid. Populations mixed. Genes flowed back and forth. Eastern Slavs, like Russians and Ukrainians, show stronger connections to Baltic populations and steppe populations. Their genes reflect a different history. Expansion northward into Baltic territories. Continued contact with steppe nomads to the south and east. Southern Slavs, like Serbs and Bulgarians, have their own unique genetic signature. They show more genetic connection to populations in Greece, Turkey, and the Balkans. Historically, southern Slavic territories were closer to the Byzantine Empire and Mediterranean populations. This proximity is written in their DNA. These genetic differences are subtle, but they're real. They tell stories of thousands of years of migration, contact, conflict, and mixing. Each Slavic region has its own unique genetics. History. Yet all Slavic peoples share fundamental genetic similarities that distinguish them as a group. This genetic picture contradicts extreme versions of nationalist ideology. When Slavic nationalism emphasizes pure ancestry and unique identity separate from other Europeans, the genetic evidence offers a counterpoint. Slavic peoples are genetically mixed. They always have been. This mixing is a source of strength and complexity, not weakness or dilution. What the DNA reveals about identity. The genetic history of Slavic peoples raises profound questions about identity. If Slavic peoples are genetically mixed, descended from Indo-European steppe warriors, pre-Indo-European Europeans, possibly Anatolian farmers, and later Viking and Mongol influences, what makes them Slavic? The answer isn't genetic purity. It never was. Slavic identity is linguistic. It's cultural. It's based on shared language, shared history, shared traditions. A person is Slavic not because they have a specific set of genes, but because they speak a Slavic language, participate in Slavic culture, and identify with Slavic history. Genetics doesn't determine identity. This is important to understand because for centuries, Various groups have tried to use pseudogenetic or racial arguments to claim exclusive claims to Slavic identity. The historical irony is that the actual genetic evidence shows Slavic peoples to be a beautiful mixture of different sources. The Slavic languages themselves reflect this mixing. Slavic languages are Indo-European, which means they inherited their basic structure from the ancient steppe-dwelling Yamnia people. But Slavic languages also borrowed heavily from local languages that existed before the Indo-European expansion. Vocabulary, grammatical structures, and pronunciation patterns show evidence of this cultural and linguistic mixing. Language and genetics don't always align. You can inherit genes from one ancestry group and language from another. This happened repeatedly throughout Slavic history. When new populations moved into Slavic territories, some were assimilated linguistically while remaining genetically distinct. When Slavic populations conquered or expanded into new areas, they imposed their language while mixing with local populations genetically. The result is complex. Modern Slavic peoples are genetically mixed, linguistically unified, and culturally diverse. This is their actual historical reality, and it's far more interesting than any myth of racial purity. Why this matters. Political consequences. The genetic history of Slavic peoples has real political implications. In the 21st century, nationalist movements across Eastern Europe have invoked ideas of Slavic racial purity and unique ancestry. These narratives have been used to justify policies of ethnic exclusion, discrimination against minorities, and territorial claims based on ethnic identity. The genetic evidence undermines these narratives. If Slavic peoples are genetically mixed, descended from multiple sources across Eurasia, then the idea of a pure Slavic race is scientifically meaningless. This doesn't mean Slavic identity is meaningless, far from it. Slavic cultural and linguistic identity is real and valuable. But that identity isn't based on genetic purity. This has implications for current conflicts. In Ukraine, Russia, and the Balkans, ethnic nationalism has been used to justify wars and territorial claims. The argument is often framed as, these are our lands because they're where our ancestors lived. The genetic evidence suggests something more complicated. Slavic ancestors came from multiple places. They mixed with other populations. Territories were inhabited, abandoned, and resettled. The notion that any particular territory belongs exclusively to a particular ethnic group based on ancient ancestry becomes harder to sustain. The genetic history suggests something different. Modern nation-states should be based on current political organization, established borders, and the rights of current inhabitants, regardless of ethnic ancestry. The genetic revelation that Slavic peoples themselves are a mixing of populations from different sources argues for humility about genetic claims to territory and identity. This is why the science matters beyond the laboratory. The Byzantine and Ottoman influence. The genetic history of Southern Slavs reveals another layer of complexity. Southern Slavic territories, the Balkans, were under Byzantine control for centuries. This wasn't just political dominance. It involved cultural exchange, religious conversion, trade, and population movement. The genetic impact is visible in the DNA of modern Balkans populations. Byzantine influence added new genetic elements to Southern Slavic populations. These elements came from Greece, Turkey, the Middle East, and other Mediterranean regions under Byzantine control. Over centuries, this created unique genetic profiles in Southern Slavic populations that distinguished them from Western and Eastern Slavs. Later, Ottoman conquest of the Balkans created further genetic and cultural mixing. The Ottoman Empire ruled the Balkans for nearly 500 years. During this period, Ottoman administrators, soldiers, and traders lived in Balkan territories, some mixed with local populations. Additionally, significant population movements occurred. Some Slavic populations migrated northward to escape Ottoman rule. In their place, other populations moved in. Turkish Romas and other groups became part of the Balkan population mix. This genetic legacy is complex and sometimes politically sensitive. In modern times, when Balkans nations claim pure Slavic identity, the genetic evidence tells a different story. Southern Slavs are Slavs? Yes. But they're also genetically connected to Mediterranean and Turkish populations through centuries of mixing. This genetic fact doesn't change anyone's right to national self-determination or independence, but it does suggest that the notion of pure ethnic identity in the Balkans is historically inaccurate. The region has always been a mixing zone. This mixing is part of its character. Disease, adaptation, and evolution. Hidden in the genetic history of Slavic peoples are stories of disease, hardship, and adaptation. The ancient DNA reveals something fascinating. At certain periods, Slavic populations show genetic signatures of having passed through genetic bottlenecks. These are periods when populations become very small, usually due to plague, famine, war, or disease. Evidence suggests that Slavic populations endured several severe bottlenecks. Around the time of the Black Plague, the 14th century, Eastern European populations were devastated. Genetic evidence shows dramatic population decline. Only certain lineages survived to pass their genes to future generations. This wasn't random. The survivors of plague are often individuals with genetic resistance to the disease. Over time, these genetic resistances became more common in surviving populations. This explains an interesting modern pattern. Some genetic studies have identified genetic variants in modern Slavic populations that provide resistance to certain diseases. These variants became common because ancestors who carried them survived historical epidemics that killed people without these genetic protections. In a sense, the plague shaped modern Slavic genetics. This is evolution in action. It's not evolution in the sense of Darwinian survival of the fittest leading to progressive improvement. It's evolution in the sense of random survival and cultural transmission. The people who survived plague were sometimes the ones with genes that happened to resist it. Their descendants inherited those genes. Over generations, they became common in the population. The adaptation went beyond genetics. Culturally, Slavic peoples adapted to survive harsh climates, periodic famines, and frequent wars. They developed agricultural practices suited to northern conditions. They built social structures that could survive political upheaval. They created cultural traditions that helped communities endure. This cultural adaptation, just like genetic adaptation, was written into the history of Slavic peoples. The modern implications? Today's genetic science can tell us where we come from. But what does that knowledge mean? For Slavic peoples, the genetic revelations raise important questions about identity in the modern world. Some people have celebrated this genetic science as proof that Slavic peoples are truly European, deeply rooted in European genetic history. Others have used it to make different arguments, that Slavic peoples have a unique genetic heritage separate from Western Europe. Both interpretations miss the deeper lesson. The lesson is that genetic ancestry doesn't determine identity, value, or rights. Slavic peoples have built complex, sophisticated civilizations. They've created great literature, music, and art. They've endured invasions, wars, and hardships that tested their character. These accomplishments aren't explained by genetics. They're explained by human culture, ingenuity, and determination. Knowing where our genes came from is interesting, but it shouldn't control how we think about ourselves or how we treat others. A Pole who discovers she has genetic ancestry from Central Asia through ancient Mongol mixing doesn't become less Polish. A Russian who learns his genome includes Viking genes doesn't become less Russian. Genetic history provides context. It offers interesting stories, but it doesn't define who we are. What truly matters is the culture we create and the values we choose to uphold. Section 14, Ongoing Mysteries. Despite remarkable advances in ancient DNA science, significant mysteries remain about Slavic genetic history. Researchers are still working to precisely identify the source populations that eventually became Proto-Slavic peoples. Some theories propose the Carpathian Mountains region. Others suggest river valleys. The exact location remains debated. The timing of linguistic developments is also unclear. When did the Proto-Slavic language develop and split into different branches? Genetic evidence can suggest when populations separated, but it can't directly tell us when languages changed. Linguists and geneticists are working together to solve this puzzle, but answers remain elusive. The role of climate in Slavic expansion is another active area of research. Some scholars believe that specific climate events, periods of favorable weather that allowed crops to grow better, enabled Slavic population expansion. Genetic evidence combined with climate data might eventually answer this question. The relationship between Slavic peoples and neighboring Baltic peoples remains complex. Baltic peoples, Lithuanians and Latvians, are genetically close to Slavs but linguistically distinct. Understanding when and how these populations separated is an ongoing research project. These mysteries should remind us that science is a process. We don't have all the answers. The genetic discoveries about Slavic peoples are remarkable, but they're also incomplete. Future research will refine these findings, correct errors, and reveal new insights. This is how science progresses. Section 15. The Bigger Picture. Understanding Slavic genetic history helps us understand Europe as a whole. Europe isn't made up of isolated populations with ancient roots and specific territories. Europe is a continent of mixing. Populations moved, they mixed. They sometimes displaced other populations. Over thousands of years, this created the genetic and cultural diversity we see today. Slavic peoples are part of this larger European story. The genetic history of Slavic peoples is a story of movement, mixing, and adaptation across thousands of years. Slavic peoples are descendants of Indo-European steppe warriors, pre-existing European populations, and later Viking and other populations that mixed with these ancestral groups. This mixing happened gradually over centuries. It wasn't conquest of one pure people by another pure people. It was the gradual movement of populations across Eurasia, the mixing of genetic lineages, and the emergence of new peoples with new languages and cultures. This genetic history matters because it tells us about human reality. Purity is a myth. All human populations are mixed. All human identities are built on the foundation of older identities. And mixing, this isn't weakness, it's strength. It's the result of human movement, curiosity, and the inevitable mixing that happens when different peoples meet. For modern Slavic peoples, this genetic revelation is an invitation to a different understanding of identity. You can be proudly Slavic, proud of the accomplishments of Slavic culture, the beauty of Slavic language, the resilience of Slavic people throughout history without claiming genetic purity. You can honor your Slavic heritage while understanding that heritage includes genetic material from many sources. This genetic humility has political implications. When nations use ethnic nationalism to justify territorial claims or discrimination, genetic evidence suggests this is historically baseless. Our ancestors mixed across borders. Our genes came from multiple sources. Our right to territory and identity isn't based on genetic purity, but on political organization, current inhabitation, and international law. The Slavic peoples have given the world remarkable contributions. They've created languages of poetry and depth. They've produced philosophers, scientists, artists, and writers of genius. They've built societies that endured invasions and recreated themselves after destruction. These accomplishments are cultural, not genetic. They come from the human spirit, not from DNA sequences. Knowing our genetic history is interesting and valuable. It connects us to the deep past. It shows us the incredible journeys our ancestors made. It reveals how all human populations are ultimately connected through migration and mixing. But it should never be used to claim superiority, justify discrimination, or deny the rights of others. The real lesson is simpler and more profound. We are all children of migrations. We are all products of mixing. We are all part of the human story that has been unfolding for hundreds of thousands of years across every continent. The Slavic peoples are part of this larger human story, a remarkable part, with their own unique cultural and linguistic heritage, but part of something larger than themselves. That's what the genes reveal, not purity, not separation, connection. If you've ever wondered where you truly come from, the answer is more complex and more beautiful than you imagined. Ancient DNA has rewritten the history of human migration and mixing. It's challenged our assumptions about identity, territory, and ancestry, and it's shown us that our genetic heritage connects us to people and places we never expected. If you want to explore your own genetic history, companies now offer affordable DNA testing that can connect you to both your ancestry and to others who share your genetic background. It's a remarkable window into your personal past. More importantly, understanding this genetic history should change how we think about identity in the modern world. When you encounter someone with a different ethnic background, remember, their ancestors migrated, mixed, and adapted just like yours did. We're all part of the same human story. That story is written in our genes, yes, but it's also written in our cultures, our languages, our values, and our character. The Slavic peoples have a remarkable genetic history and an even more remarkable cultural heritage. But that heritage belongs to them not because they're genetically pure. It belongs to them because they've created it, lived it, and passed it down. That's what truly matters.